Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We'll let folks get settled and tuned in. I'm excited to kick us off today. Happy Thursday. My name is Joy Mayer, and I am the director of Trusting News. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some folks who might be new to what we do here. Trusting News has been around since 2016, and we study how people decide what news to trust and train journalists and educators in how to demonstrate credibility and earn trust. I'm very excited about today's conversation. I feel like I've been waiting weeks or months or maybe even years to have it. So thank you for helping us kick off what I think is a really important part of a new initiative we're working on at Trusting News called A Road to Pluralism. So what I'm going to do is lay the groundwork a little bit with what we're up to and why today's questions are so important to us. And then we're going to hear from a couple of journalists we've been working with about their experiences. And then we're going to open it up to you guys to talk about what your observations are and what your frustrations and wishes are around who journalists are and how our blind spots and biases might affect our work in a variety of ways. So feel free to chat as we go, and we are recording. I think Zoom should have warned you about that, but we're sharing the link, sharing the replay with folks who registered. So basically, we at Trusting News with this Road to Pluralism project, we are talking about how the news is received by people who see the world in different ways, and how engaging with people across the political spectrum and from a variety of life experiences and worldviews, what that looks like for journalists, especially for local journalists. We're talking about who's producing the news and what we as human beings have in common with our audiences and what we don't. So the reason we're focusing on this project, on this specific element of biases and blind spots, is that we know, of course we know, that who we are as people affects how we see the world. We rely on each other in newsrooms a lot to fill in the blanks and to check us, right? Like all of us who've been in newsrooms know what that's like to say to somebody like, before I take this list of questions, to Matt was telling me before we started that his dad's a pastor, right? My dad worked in church work too. So if you're going to go interview a pastor, you're going to be like, oh, Matt's dad's a pastor. I should like check and see if there's anything I should know if that's not a world that I grew up in, right? We have a long history in newsrooms of relying on each other to help us see the world in more nuanced ways, help us avoid pitfalls and roadblocks and that sort of thing. We also know, however, and don't talk nearly enough, that journalists have a lot in common with each other. There are shared life experiences that we have and assumptions and values that we share, partly because of our paths through the world, partly because of the things that draw us to journalism, honestly, that give us things in common that might make us different than the communities we serve. We also know that the experiences we have inform, of course, how we report, what we think is important, what questions we choose to ask, and that therefore informs how we describe the world. So that is what we're here to talk about. Another element of that is the culture of our newsrooms and how, when we do have people in the newsroom with non-dominant views, when we have people with different life experiences or different assumptions or values, do those people feel empowered to speak up and to check their colleagues and to push for a different framing, to avoid an insensitive word choice, to cover something that the rest of the newsroom doesn't feel should be covered? Or do those people feel squashed? So that is my setup. Super easy challenges we have on the table today. And I'm excited to introduce a couple journalists we've worked with recently to kind of set us up. And then we're going to open it up for you guys. So I have Matt and Aki here. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself first and share some opening thoughts?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Matthew. Matt, you can also call me MLM. I'll answer to all of them. Let me see here. I am the community engagement manager at KCUR, which is the public radio station that serves the Kansas City area, right here on the Missouri-Kansas border. I guess the work that I did with Trusting News and Conservative Voices was, one, really rewarding. I think it just it was an awesome excuse to talk to our audience. But it was also one that was certainly challenging in terms of made me wonder about like how I and my colleagues could do our work perhaps even better or differently. But on the other hand, it was also kind of, it was this other question. The big thing that came up for me was that I was only talking to people who had listened to our promo and said, hey, I'm a person who thinks of myself as conservative, and I'd like to share my perspective. So I recognized it was like a subset of our audience. So we never ran into someone who would describe themselves as a Trump supporter. In fact, I think it was like in our data set, so just the people who came through KCUR, only 13% of people describe themselves as a Trump supporter. So I talked to one of those 13% people, but it overwhelmingly was this type of conservative person who I would also call like a public radio person. Like they're just deeply curious and like they seek out information and challenge themselves with their viewpoints. And I think that that's like so it was very reaffirming to have that common denominator come across. And the thing that I've talked about a little bit or raised a question with in previous conversations with Trusting News was like, I think we have this national narrative of like the trust in media is eroding. And I would not say that that's not true. I would say kind of a yes and thing. My experience was talking to some of these individuals and looking at the data is that like, we may not have a shared definition of what trust means. And we may want to explore that more deeply in conversations like the ones that I did. In terms of like, I would ask people if they had, like, well, do you trust the news? And they would say, well, what do you mean? Like they would ask me a question, like, what do you mean by trust? And like, well, when you see something like on national media that like, like the Capitol is being attacked or stormed, do you trust that that is happening? And like everyone would say, well, yeah, I trust that, but it's all about like the framing around it. And so I think that sometimes people are conflating trust and value because like we value what we trust and we trust what we value. Like, I think we just need to be very careful, thoughtful, and deliberate about and keep returning to like, what are we actually talking about when we talk about these words? Because I think we have different understandings and they're very contextual, and we may, language is always shifting under our feet. I don't know. So that's where I'll start. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I've already said a lot. I hope that that's a good start. I'm happy to loop back, but Aki, do you want to introduce yourself? Take it away.
Let me jump in real quick first. Matt, thank you so much. I realized that I left something super crucial out of my intro for those of you who are new to the project, which is Aki and Matt both participated with us in some recent research we did with the Center for Media Engagement, where we sent local journalists out to interview people in their communities who lean right. We wanted to kick off our Road to Pluralism project with deeper insight about a demographic we knew had especially low trust in news. So their recent experience with this is rooted in reaching out there, but the project overall is not only about reaching out to conservatives, it's about understanding what people with different life experiences think of journalism and what their relationship with it is. And Matt also mentioned that he heard from people that they had this sense, this really stuck with me, that they had this sense that his listeners had the sense that journalists had like a right way to look at an issue. Like they could feel through the coverage, like not that journalists were saying that, just that things were presented in a way that made it seem like there was a right and wrong side of an issue. Aki, hi, thanks for being here.
Hi. So I'm Aki Soga. I'm the engagement editor for the Burlington Free Press in Vermont. We're part of the Gannett chain. And I've been here about 30 years. So I'm an old timer in the newsroom. It's kind of startling to suddenly realize I've been here longer than anybody else when it just seems like I just started. But one of the interesting things about Vermont is, like you're not a local, you're not a native unless you have a couple generations in the local cemetery. So I'll always be this flatlander who came up here recently. Anyway, that does segue into kind of who we are in the newsroom. We're a small paper. The character of our newsroom has changed in the time I have been there. It's gone from kind of a place where people made a local career and sunk roots into the community. We had several people who grew up in Vermont, grew up in Burlington with the paper. Right now, we have 2 people who were born in our area and work, which we're very fortunate, but our staff tends to be transient, which automatically sets us apart from the community. It tends to be younger since we don't pay that well. It is a place for people in the early stages of their career. We are beginning again to have staffers with children, some of them in schools. We did seem to run a period when we had this kind of baby boom in the newsroom where we had a lot of people with kids in the schools. And then we went through a period when we had very few people with kids in the schools, either because their kids had aged out of the local public schools or because young people didn't have families yet. Again kind of changes the demographic or sets us apart from the community at large, especially since so much of our coverage has to do with schools. I could see kind of a drop off in the flow of information about what's going on in various schools as the children of newsroom staffers left those schools and no longer got regular bulletins. So that's different. Again, because that's the bar. This is the bar we set. Everybody who works for us has a college degree. That wasn't always, when I started, it wasn't always the case. Not everybody in the newsroom had a college degree, but now it is. Vermont is a highly educated state, and the Burlington area even more so. So that doesn't set us that far apart, but still, we don't have the diversity in the educational background, and we're all white collar professionals. So we're apart from the blue collar agricultural, people with those kind of backgrounds. We don't really have that connection. So in various aspects, we do have a whole bunch of blind spots. Another thing we found out recently is that for a few years now, we've had no one in the newsroom who served in the military. Probably in the last 5 years, maybe 6 years. And as we try to weigh in on look at coverage of veterans issues, and that kind of made it apparent to us. So there are, we work, both as a newsroom and as a corporation, we work very hard at diversity, what we call diversity. And, we've looked at gender, we've looked at, gender identity, we've looked at, race and ethnicity, and I think we've made strides in those areas. But we're creating diversity within a limited field, I think. Yes, we're finding people with various different backgrounds, different life experiences, but when you step away to a broader view, we all seem to fall into the same bucket anyway. So it's diversity within a certain subset rather than a diversity that completely reflects our entire community. And I think that does leave us with a handicap in trying to cover a community. And, frankly, I think most people as Joy said, in the news business, or many people, and especially like a newsroom like ours, tend to be more on the liberal side of the political spectrum. Not always the case. We've had editors who are conservative. When we had a publisher, our newsrooms, our organization no longer had publishers. Publishers tend to be more conservative than the newsroom, and that tends to provide a little more balance. I think that is gone. I remember, I used to be the editorial page editor, and I would meet with the publishers and go over positions, and that provides a balance of someone who has a certain viewpoint that's different from someone with a news background that tends, where I guess part of our mission is to question authority, question institutions, where maybe someone on the business side is less prone to be in that position, but I think that balance is less present, especially as newsrooms shrink. So, we have a lot of challenges, and it helps us that we're trying to be conscious of those shortcomings of ours as we've tried to figure out what to cover and how to cover it.
Joy, can I step in and just add a little bit more, because I can maybe think
please do.
a little more deeply. I was just remembering when I was starting this work, I had a colleague who wrote me an email and CC'd our general manager and said, I could kiss you for doing this work. And he was just saying that he just valued it so much. And I think Aki, referring to like how much, perceptions of like the liberal bend that we have in our own organization. Because, we're very much like a lot of other community, we're a more blueberry surrounded by a cherry pie, as the expression goes. I think I stole that from someone in Austin, Texas, but, an urban center surrounded by more conservative rural places. And so, when we think about like the diversity of our newsrooms, it's definitely something that KCUR also thinks about and is wrestling with.
Thank you. So we've been talking about this at Trusting News as a matter of intellectual diversity, the idea that the real purpose behind any sort of diversity efforts are to get people who think differently, have different experiences, bring those to their work, right? So here's where we stop sort of presenting some prearranged thoughts to you and get your guys' input on things. And I have an idea. We're going to try something new for how to get input. We do have some questions we're going to throw out to the group, but I want to be respectful of the fact that sometimes the things we have to share are tricky. Some people might feel more comfortable sharing anonymously, and that I just want to make people feel comfortable sharing some quick thoughts to get us started. So I'm going to stick in the chat a link to a Google slide deck that is publicly editable that has some questions for you guys. So I hope that you can go to the chat and pull up this Google slide spreadsheet. It invites you to basically address three things. The first one is, does your newsroom have a culture of empowerment and diversity of thought? How comfortable do staffers feel challenging each other's ideas, priorities, and coverage? And I invite you to drag one of the little colored dots at the bottom onto the scale of 1 to 10, both for people who have a lot of authority and social capital in the newsroom and for people who don't have much at all. And then the other questions we're inviting you to answer in one of the little text boxes is, what voices are missing in your newsroom? Think about diversity of perspective and experience across some typical fault lines like gender, age, class, race. Think about political leanings, work experience, family experience, that sort of thing. And then the next question is one I hope we can get to if we have time today, but I'm very interested in our hiring practices in newsrooms and how hiring practices could get more at some of the intellectual diversity, just cultural perspectives and life experiences. No, we're not going to ask people how they voted.